Did you hear what she said? Emma asked, her voice trembling with disbelief as she stood in the living room, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Who, Mrs. McAllister? Mark replied, raising an eyebrow as he glanced up from his laptop, the soft glow illuminating his concerned expression. What did she do this time? She told me that she's been in contact with the city council about our house, Emma exclaimed, pacing the room. She thinks it should be hers because she claims it was built on her land. Mark sighed heavily, pushing his laptop aside. That's ridiculous, Em. We've lived here for 3 years, and we have all the paperwork to prove it. I thought we settled that last year when she tried to claim the fence was on her property. Emma nodded, frustration bubbling within her. I know, but she's relentless. I don't understand why she's so obsessed with us. It's like she's made it her life's mission to make us miserable. Let's not let her get to us, Mark said, attempting to reassure her. We'll just talk to our lawyer. If she's really trying to pull something, we can handle it. Emma stopped pacing, her hands falling to her sides. You're right, but it just feels like we're constantly on guard. Every time I see her in the yard, it's like she's plotting something. Just then, a loud knock echoed from the front door. The couple exchanged wary glances. Who could that be? Mark asked, rising from his chair. I hope it's not her. Maybe it's the city council. Emma joked, attempting to lighten the mood, though her eyes reflected anxiety. As Mark opened the door, there stood Mrs. McAllister, her beady eyes glinting with an unsettling mix of determination and smugness. Well, if it isn't my lovely neighbors, she said, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness. Mrs. McAllister, Mark said cautiously, stepping aside to let her in. What brings you here? Oh, just a friendly visit, she replied, her smile wide yet unconvincing. I thought I'd pop in and share some important news with you too. Emma shifted nervously. What kind of news? I've been doing some digging, Mrs. McAllister said, her fingers tapping against her chin as if she were savoring the moment. And it seems that there are discrepancies in your property lines. Mark frowned, crossing his arms. What discrepancies? She leaned in closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a scandalous secret. I believe your house is infringing on my property, by a whole 10 feet. Emma gasped, glancing at Mark. That's not possible. We have our surveys and everything. Oh, dear, Mrs. McAllister replied, feigning innocence. I'm not saying it's intentional, but I've already spoken to the council. They're sending someone out to investigate. They may even consider legal action. You're bluffing, Mark retorted, his tone sharp. You can't just claim our house like that. We have the documents. Mrs. McAllister's smile widened, and she shrugged casually. Oh, I'm just the messenger here. You'll see, the council is taking this very seriously. I wouldn't want to be in your shoes when they come knocking. Get out, Emma said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. You're not welcome here. Why, thank you for the invitation, Mrs. McAllister quipped, backing toward the door. But just remember, I'm looking out for the neighborhood. It's my duty to ensure everything is in order. Mark closed the door with a solid thud, shaking his head. What a nightmare. I can't believe this, Emma said, running her fingers through her hair. We need to contact our lawyer now. If she's actually gone to the council, we need to be prepared. Mark nodded, pulling out his phone. I'll call Jason. He'll know what to do. As Mark dialed the lawyer's number, Emma paced the living room once more. I never thought it would come to this. I just want to live in peace. Yeah, Mark said, his brow furrowed in concentration as he spoke into the phone. Hi, Jason. We have a situation? Yes, it's about Mrs. McAllister again. Emma's heart raced as she overheard snippets of the conversation. She's claiming we're on her property. No, we have the surveys. We need legal advice on how to handle this. Can we meet tomorrow? Mark hung up, running a hand over his face. He's going to help us. We'll figure this out. Good, Emma said, though a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. I just hate that she's trying to control our lives. What's next? Is she going to put a fence around our yard? Mark chuckled lightly, though the tension remained. Let's not give her any more ideas. We can't let her intimidate us. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Emma and Mark sat together in silence, the weight of the impending battle looming over them. The next day, Emma met Mark at their favorite coffee shop, clutching her mug as she recounted the previous night's events. I still can't shake off how smug she looked, like she was reveling in our discomfort. Mark nodded, staring into his cup. I think she enjoys the power she feels over us. We just need to make sure we stay one step ahead. Do you think we should confront her? Emma suggested, a fire igniting within her. Show her that we're not afraid? Mark shook his head. I don't think that's wise. We have to be careful. Let's let the lawyer handle the situation first. Fine, Emma relented, but her fingers drummed anxiously on the table. It's just so frustrating. I never expected to be in a legal battle with a neighbor. Neither did I, Mark replied, taking a sip of his coffee. But we'll get through it together. We always do. As they left the cafe, Emma felt a surge of determination. They would fight this together, and no neighbor from hell would take their home away from them. Little did they know, Mrs. McAllister was only getting started. The next morning arrived with a heavy fog blanketing the neighborhood. Emma stood by the window, peering out as she sipped her coffee, her mind racing with thoughts of Mrs. McAllister and her latest threat. Do you think she's already plotting her next move? Emma asked, turning to Mark, who was busy packing his briefcase for work. I wouldn't put it past her, Mark replied with a sigh. But we can't let her get to us. Remember what Jason said, just stick to the facts, and don't engage with her unless necessary. Emma nodded but still felt uneasy. I just wish we could find a way to end this once and for all. Just then, the doorbell rang, causing both of them to jump. Emma shot Mark a worried glance. What if it's her again? Let me check, Mark said, putting down his briefcase and heading toward the door. When he opened it, there stood Jason, their lawyer, looking sharp in his tailored suit. Good morning. I hope I'm not interrupting anything, he said, stepping inside. No, not at all, Emma replied, relieved to see a familiar face. We were just talking about you. Good things, I hope? Jason grinned, taking a seat at the kitchen table. More like how to deal with Mrs. McAllister, Mark said, joining them at the table. She's claiming our house is on her property, and it feels like she's gearing up for a legal fight. Right, I spoke to the council this morning, and they confirmed they've received her complaints, Jason explained, flipping open his notepad. But we have the upper hand here. You both have all the documentation to support your claims. What should we do? Emma asked, her fingers nervously tapping on the table. We'll prepare a formal response, Jason replied. I suggest we gather all your paperwork and any correspondence you've had with her. It'll strengthen your case. Mark nodded, his expression turning serious. What if she tries to escalate things? Leave that to me, Jason assured them. I'll draft a letter outlining the legal boundaries of your property and remind her of the consequences of making false claims. But first, let's focus on getting everything we need. Emma felt a rush of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by the memory of Mrs. McAllister's smug expression. What if she tries to retaliate? She seems like the type who would do anything to get what she wants. Jason leaned back in his chair, considering her words. It's possible, but that's why we have to be cautious. If she makes any threats or tries to intimidate you, document everything. It'll help us if we need to take further action. Okay, I'll keep a record, Emma promised, her resolve strengthening. But I really want to confront her. I'm tired of living in fear of her antics. Mark placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. We need to focus on what we can control. Let's get our facts straight first. After Jason left, Emma and Mark spent the rest of the day organizing their documents. They filled out charts and diagrams of their property lines, compiled emails, and noted any interactions with Mrs. McAllister. By evening, they felt more prepared but still anxious. Let's take a break, Mark suggested, rubbing his eyes. How about we watch something lighthearted? Emma smiled, grateful for the distraction. Sounds good, I could use a laugh. As they settled in on the couch, laughter filled the room, momentarily easing their tension. But as the credits rolled, the doorbell rang again. Seriously? Emma said, frustration creeping in again. Is it her? Let's just see, Mark replied, standing up once more. He opened the door, and this time, Mrs. McAllister stood there, her expression unfriendly and smug as ever. Good evening, dear neighbors, she called, her tone overly cheerful. What do you want? Mark asked, already on edge. Oh, I just wanted to let you know that I spoke with some folks at the council, she said, her eyes glinting with mischief. They're very interested in your property dispute. Emma stepped forward, crossing her arms defiantly. You're wasting your time, Mrs. McAllister. We have all the documents to prove that our house is not on your land. She waved a hand dismissively. Documents, those can be altered. I'm just trying to ensure everything is fair in this neighborhood. You wouldn't want any discrepancies to go unexamined, would you? Mark clenched his jaw. You're harassing us, and you know it. Mrs. McAllister leaned closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. Just remember, I have friends in high places. You might think you're safe now, but things can change quickly. Get off our property, Emma snapped, her voice firm. We're done with your games. Mrs. McAllister's smile vanished for a split second before it returned, more sinister than before. Oh, sweetie, this isn't a game. This is just the beginning. With that, she turned on her heel and strutted away, leaving Emma and Mark standing in stunned silence. Did you hear that? Emma asked, breathless. She's actually threatening us. I can't believe this, Mark said, shaking his head. We need to contact Jason again. They retreated into the house, feeling the tension in the air thickening. Mark picked up his phone, quickly dialing their lawyer. Hey, Jason, we need to discuss Mrs. McAllister again. Yeah, it's getting worse. She just came by and made some serious threats. As Mark spoke, Emma paced the living room, her thoughts racing. This can't go on, she muttered to herself. She can't just bully us out of our own home. After hanging up, Mark turned to her, concern etched on his face. Jason wants us to keep a log of everything she says or does from now on. He believes it'll help us strengthen our case. Fine, Emma said, resolve flooding her. I'll record every interaction. She's not going to get away with this. Days turned into a blur of tension as they prepared for what felt like an impending storm. Each time Emma saw Mrs. McAllister in her yard, she felt a surge of anger and fear. It was a game of cat and mouse, and for once, she didn't want to be the mouse. But as their preparations continued, little did they know that Mrs. McAllister was only getting started. The more they fought back, the more she doubled down, setting the stage for a showdown neither of them could have anticipated. That weekend, as Emma and Mark sat down to review their documentation, a loud banging echoed from outside. Emma jumped up, her heart racing. What now? Mark looked out the window, and his expression hardened. It's Mrs. McAllister, and she's not alone. Gathering her courage, Emma stepped to the window, and her stomach dropped. A group of people was standing in their front yard, with Mrs. McAllister at the forefront, waving her arms dramatically. Is that a group of her friends? Emma asked incredulously, panic rising within her. I think so, Mark said, eyes narrowing. We need to go out there and see what's happening. Together, they walked outside, the cool air doing little to ease the tension between them and their neighbor. Ah, here they are, Mrs. McAllister exclaimed, her voice carrying across the yard. I was just explaining to my friends how you two are trying to infringe on my land. They're here to support me. Support you in what? Mark shot back, fists clenching at his sides. You're lying about your claims. Mrs. McAllister smirked, her eyes glimmering with delight. Oh, come now. Just because you have some documents doesn't mean they're valid. My friends and I are here to ensure that everyone knows the truth. Emma felt a surge of anger bubbling up. You're creating a scene for no reason. This is our home. Is it really, though? One of Mrs. McAllister's friends chimed in, crossing her arms. Maybe we should have a closer look at those documents. You have no right to be here, Mark said, his voice firm. If you're trying to intimidate us, it's not going to work. Mrs. McAllister took a step forward, raising her chin defiantly. It's not intimidation if I'm just presenting the facts to the neighborhood. We all deserve to know who's trying to take what belongs to someone else. As the confrontation escalated, Emma's mind raced, searching for a way to regain control of the situation. You all need to leave. We're not doing this here. I think we should hold a neighborhood meeting, Mrs. McAllister declared, her voice dripping with self-righteousness. We can invite everyone to discuss the issue. I'm sure they'd want to know what's really happening. Mark stepped forward, anger sparking in his eyes. This isn't a public trial, and you're not the judge here. You need to back off. But Mrs. McAllister merely smiled, enjoying the chaos she'd created. Oh, but the more people know, the more support I'll gather. I think it's a splendid idea. As her friends started to murmur in agreement, Emma felt the walls closing in around her. This has gone too far, she whispered to Mark, feeling defeated. We can't let her win, Mark said, grabbing her hand. We'll find a way to stop her. As the crowd continued to gather, each person's eyes shifting between Emma, Mark, and Mrs. McAllister, one thing became clear. This was just the beginning of a battle that would test their resolve, their unity, and ultimately, their home. Let's just walk away, Emma urged Mark, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. We can't engage with her crowd. It'll only give her more power. Mark clenched his jaw, his eyes scanning the small group gathering on their front lawn. If we walk away now, she'll take it as a victory. We need to stand our ground. Are you sure that's a good idea? Emma asked, feeling her heart race. What if this gets out of hand? We'll just be calm and collected, Mark replied, glancing back at their neighbors, who were starting to whisper among themselves, casting sideways glances at the confrontation unfolding. We can't let her manipulate the narrative. With a deep breath, Emma nodded. Okay, let's do this. But I'm not going to let her bully me. Good, we'll tell our side of the story. As they stepped closer to the group, Mrs. McAllister noticed them and raised her voice, drawing the attention of the onlookers. Ah, look who it is. The homeowners of the house in question. Why don't you tell us about the property lines? Why don't you explain why you think it's acceptable to take what isn't yours? Mark took a step forward, grounding himself with determination. We're not taking anything. We bought this house legally, and we have all the documents to prove it. If you have an issue, take it up with the city council, not us. Exactly, Emma chimed in, her voice steady despite her nerves. You're making wild claims without any evidence. A few neighbors exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering across their faces. One woman stepped forward, her brow furrowed in concern. What's really going on here? Mrs. McAllister seized the moment, spinning her tale. I've been trying to protect the integrity of our neighborhood. This house, she pointed dramatically at their home, is built on land that belongs to me. I've even contacted the council, and they're taking my concerns very seriously. Mark raised an eyebrow. And yet, you've never provided any proof of your claims. Just because you say something doesn't make it true. Why don't we see those documents? Another neighbor piped up, skepticism growing in the crowd. Emma felt her heart thud painfully in her chest. We can show you the documents. We've already shared them with Jason, our lawyer. If you want to hear the facts, we'll gladly share. Why would we believe you? Mrs. McAllister interjected, her tone condescending. You're just two young people who think they can do whatever they want. I'm looking out for this community. We don't need you to look out for us, Mark shot back, his voice rising. We're perfectly capable of doing that ourselves. Mrs. McAllister's smile faltered momentarily, but she quickly regained her composure. Oh, dear, I think it's time for a neighborhood meeting. We can discuss this openly and decide what should be done about your property. Everyone has a right to voice their concerns. A murmur rippled through the crowd as several neighbors exchanged worried looks. Why don't we hear both sides? One older gentleman suggested, scratching his chin. It might be a good idea to get to the bottom of this. Let's do it, Mrs. McAllister exclaimed, her enthusiasm palpable. How about next Saturday? I'll send out a flyer to everyone. Fine, Mark said, his frustration boiling over. But know this. We won't stand for any false accusations. You're trying to bully us into submission, and it won't work. Mrs. McAllister chuckled, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. Oh, I'm not trying to bully anyone. I'm simply trying to protect our neighborhood from you too. As the crowd began to disperse, Emma turned to Mark, her stomach churning. What just happened? This isn't good. Mark sighed, his expression serious. We need to prepare for that meeting. We can't let her turn the neighborhood against us. The following week, Emma and Mark poured every ounce of their energy into preparing for the neighborhood meeting. They compiled documents, gathered evidence, and made a presentation outlining their case. Emma even reached out to Jason for advice on how to best present their side to the neighbors. When Saturday finally arrived, Emma felt a mix of anxiety and determination. She glanced at Mark as they stood at the front door, ready to face the crowd. Are you ready? More than ready, he replied, squeezing her hand reassuringly. We've got this. As they walked to the community center, the air buzzed with tension. A sizable crowd had gathered, with chairs set up in a circle. Emma spotted Mrs. McAllister at the front, surrounded by her supporters, her demeanor exuding confidence. Look at her, Emma whispered to Mark, her heart racing. She's so smug. I hate this. Stay focused, Mark said, adjusting his tie. We're here for the truth. As the meeting began, Mrs. McAllister opened with a dramatic speech. Thank you all for coming. I wanted to bring attention to an important issue that affects us all. My neighbors here have constructed their home in a way that directly infringes upon my property rights. Murmurs filled the room as neighbors exchanged glances. Mark and Emma exchanged a look, steeling themselves for the battle ahead. Let's hear from them, someone called from the back, their voice a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Taking a deep breath, Mark stood up, leading Emma to the front. We appreciate everyone coming here today to discuss this issue, he began, his voice steady. But let's be clear. We bought our home legally, and we have the documentation to prove it. He pulled out a large map detailing the property lines, laying it on the table for all to see. Here are the surveys, showing that our property lines are clearly defined and do not encroach upon Mrs. McAllister's land. We even had the city conduct an inspection when we purchased the home. Emma stepped forward, her voice unwavering. We understand the importance of community and property rights, but what Mrs. McAllister is claiming is unfounded. We've tried to resolve this privately, but it seems she's intent on turning this into a public spectacle. Mrs. McAllister interjected, her voice laced with indignation. You're manipulating the facts. Just because you have documents doesn't mean they're accurate. Mark maintained his composure. We've been nothing but transparent about our ownership. If you have evidence to the contrary, we would like to see it. The crowd began to murmur again, some appearing more skeptical of Mrs. McAllister than before. Why are you so determined to cause trouble for your neighbors? Another neighbor asked, curiosity lighting their eyes. I'm protecting my rights, Mrs. McAllister insisted, her voice rising. If they can take my land, what's stopping anyone else? I think you're the one trying to take something that doesn't belong to you. A woman chimed in from the back, her tone firm. The tide was turning, and Emma felt hope blossom in her chest. Mark continued, we are not trying to take anything from anyone. We simply want to live in our home in peace, as we have done for years. Mrs. McAllister's claims are baseless and designed to instill fear in the community. As the meeting progressed, Emma felt the crowd's energy shift. Neighbors began to question Mrs. McAllister's motives, and she could see the cracks forming in her facade. Finally, someone raised their hand. What do you think will happen if this continues? The man asked. If we start accusing each other of encroaching on land, where will it end? Mrs. McAllister opened her mouth to respond but found herself at a loss for words. The crowd's growing skepticism was palpable, and she struggled to regain control. Seeing an opening, Emma seized the moment. We want to resolve this amicably. We love this neighborhood just as much as anyone here, and we only want to contribute positively to our community. Let's focus on what unites us instead of what divides us. The room fell silent, and a wave of agreement rippled through the crowd. Let's hear from our lawyer, someone suggested, and the crowd nodded in agreement. Encouraged, Mark pulled out his phone and quickly texted Jason, asking him to join the meeting. As they waited, the atmosphere shifted to one of camaraderie, everyone eager to find common ground. When Jason arrived, he brought with him a sense of authority. I've reviewed the case, and I believe there are solutions that can satisfy everyone. The council has protocols for property disputes, and we can work together to resolve this without unnecessary drama. Mrs. McAllister's face fell, her previous confidence shattered as the room buzzed with approval for Jason's suggestions. We can set up a meeting with the city to ensure everyone's interests are respected, Jason continued. This doesn't have to escalate further. Let's focus on collaboration rather than confrontation. As he spoke, Emma felt the weight of anxiety lift off her shoulders. It was a turning point, and they had finally gained the upper hand. After the meeting, as the crowd began to disperse, neighbors approached Emma and Mark, offering words of support. We believe you, one woman said, smiling warmly. You've done a great job standing up for yourselves. Mrs. McAllister, now visibly shaken, was left standing on the sidelines, her earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. As Emma and Mark walked home hand in hand, relief flooded over them. I can't believe that worked, Emma exclaimed, her heart racing with excitement. We really turned the tide. Mark grinned, the weight of the past weeks finally lifting. We did it together. We stood our ground, and that made all the difference. Just then, Emma spotted Mrs. McAllister in her yard, staring at them with a mix of disbelief and fury. But for the first time, Emma felt unafraid. We'll be fine, she said, her voice steady. Whatever she tries next, we'll be ready. We have each other, and we have the truth on our side. As they walked toward their home, the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. It was a reminder that no matter how dark the storm, the light would always return, bringing with it hope, strength, and unity. Emma smiled, knowing they had fought for their home and won, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead together.